I'm Peter Riddell. I'm the director of the Institute for Government. Welcome here, our fourth event in 5 days. They're all very different types of events. And this one will promise to be very different indeed. It's by two of our most prolific diarists. Their volumes. Chris has produced 3 volumes of diaries and many other books, novels, etc., and he's busy into further creation. Alastair has so far produced...
I have them all.
You have... yeah, Chris got all the Chris volumes. I'll come on to the plugging later.
I'm plugging his. This is Chris Mullin. Very, very good.
I'm trying to get you guys to disagree.
Sorry.
And with Alastair's produced one overall volume, which was the tasteful one, and then he's produced the 3 so far unexpurgated ones, and we've got another one to come in the summer on the lead up to the Iraq War. But his life has been much fuller than that, so we'll have a lot more from him. Now, on my shelves at home, I got down all the volumes to read over the weekend, one member of my family compared it to my collection of wisdoms. Little did she realise when she said that they're almost as valuable to me as wisdom. The extracts, the wisdom.
There's a lot more balls in them.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of sticky wickets quite often. The great thing about these 2 diaries is they provide a wonderful insight into what happened during the Blair years and before. The media features strongly in both of them, and this is the latest in our series on media and government, which is sponsored by Fisherman Hedges, who are our partners. And I'll mention them a bit further on later in the discussion. But what we wanted to bring out was 2 people, and if you look at the diaries, one interesting features is that Chris features a bit in Alastair's diary. When he was appointed to the government, he was mentioned as a left-winger, and so perceptions change. Alastair, however, features frequently in Chris's diaries. But what's fascinating, and we've been talking about this beforehand, in a rather approving way, and their views on the media also come out quite strikingly. For example, when Alastair's overall volume appeared in 2007, Chris records how Hilary Benn, was struck, as was I, by the extreme degree of access that Piers Morgan and other tabloid lowlife enjoyed. Or what a waste of time it was. Then he makes the point, political journalists are the biggest spinners of all. Well, in an earlier life, I used to be a political journalist. I've repented in order to be director here. And also, Alastair, I feature occasionally in Alastair's diary, including a very perceptive remark in November 1998. Riddell, a bit set in his ways. And he also...
But, there was a big but before that.
There was a big but.
Yeah.
And also, he got a partially right a description that I wasn't totally bowled over by one Tony Blair speech in the 1999 Labour conference, and says Peter said it was all too much Richard and Judy, which I feel was a bit more Alastair than me. But then he said to me, and that's where he showed his skills. He said, "You're unspinnable, Peter," which is the most clever bit of spin I've ever heard. And in the reflections on the media, which both have, when Chris was appointed a minister for the first time, because Chris's life was of many comings and goings, in 1999, Alastair did a briefing for new ministers. And he recorded that, Alastair said, political coverage in this country is a joke. The national media treat politics as a soap opera. His view didn't change. In 2005, Chris records, was it all worthwhile? At the outset, he's talking about relationships between politicians and the media. At the outset, maybe, but once we had won, I would have hoped we'd keep the media at arm's length instead of continuing to suck up to them. It got us nowhere in the end. Now, what we're looking at tonight, I'm going to be talking to Alastair and Chris on various themes of the relationship between the media and government. How influential is the media? Spin tends to be associated with Alastair, but I do remember one or two of Alastair's predecessors who did try to influence journalists like me, often with as much subtlety and grace as Alastair often did. And also, Tony Blair, in one of his farewell lectures, talked about the feral beast. How can ministers and civil servants deal with it? Now, that's going to be one of the themes we're going to do, but what I want to start off with, I'll start with you, Alastair, is first, you became very disillusioned with the media pretty quickly. I mean, you started working for Tony Blair in 1994, but your disillusion was absolutely clear almost after you got into government. But how was the media culture making it harder to govern?
I don't know if it was making it harder to govern, and probably until about 2000-ish. When the kind of iron entered my soul about a lot of the media was around the time of the foot and mouth and the fuel protest, when it was perfectly clear to me that the media had precious little interest actually in communicating. I'm not about all the media, but parts of the media. And in this, I think television as bad as newspapers, that their interest was not really about informing the public about what was going on. It was realising that there were these extraordinary stories, these extraordinary situations, and actually they could become players as well as spectators, and they could make things worse, and that would then make it worse for the government, and we'd have to deal with a bigger crisis than the one that we started with. So, and you know, I stand by every single word that I wrote in my submission to Leveson. It was a sort of steady progression towards the trivialisation, towards the fusion of news and comment, towards, as I said, I didn't realise it was early as 1999, the treatment of politics like a soap opera. And it was interesting, I've just been going through Chris's books again and sort of just in advance of this. And it's interesting, I think Chris and I, from very different perspectives, coming to feel that this was having a profoundly corrosive impact upon government, upon the quality of people that were going into politics, the kind of length of time that people would stay in politics, and what the public would think of politicians. And what the media, large parts of them, conveniently then did was to turn me, Peter Mandelson, anybody remotely involved with what might loosely be termed spin, into these bogey figures that we were bullying them, we were making their lives terribly difficult. And I've always said, people like you, people like Phil Webster, people like Lionel Barber, there are lots and lots of journalists that I could name and list and say they are very, very good journalists who operate by the highest standards, but the culture got itself into a really, really bad place. And the more I went on about it, I think the worse it became. Eventually, I mean, I left long after I wanted to leave, and one of the reasons I wanted to leave was because I'd frankly become sick of banging my head against a brick wall.
Now, you saw it from a different angle, Chris, because for most of your period, you were a backbencher. You chaired a select committee, the Home Affairs Select Committee. You were also taking up what were conventionally thought of as unpopular causes quite often, whether in your civil liberties or later legislative ones. How difficult did the media make what you were doing? And we'll come on to some of the Leveson stuff later on.
Well, I suppose the big one I was involved in started before I became a Member of Parliament, and that was the attempt to put right the miscarriages of justice that occurred in the mid-1970s, but they rumbled on into the early 1990s. And actually the more serious end of the media was quite helpful as regards that. The Times, the Guardian, the Independent, BBC.
The Mirror.
Yes, the Mirror.
Mr.
Yes,
Foote.
But at the tabloid end, with the exception of the Mirror, it was very difficult. I mean, I have my favourite Sun headlines framed on my wall at home. Looney MP backs bomb gang covers the whole front page of the Sun now. We can laugh about it now, but if you depend on votes for a living, as I did at that time, and the Sun goes through the door of, well, possibly half of my constituents in a very working class constituency, it's not helpful to have them being told quite often that you're a friend of terrorists. And the Sun carried on even after the convictions had been quashed. It cost them actually a great deal of money, none of which came to me, I hasten to add. But I've got 20 things you didn't know about crackpot, Chris. I didn't know most of those either. Mr. Odious, it's a little known fact that I very briefly displaced Ken Livingstone as the most odious man in Britain. But it was a bit of a problem, but by that time I knew we were going to win in the end, so I thought stuff them.
But let's look at it, in terms of issues. How much did it make you, when you were working for Tony Blair, particularly after May '97, how did it make you more risk averse? Did you feel, I mean, Europe's obviously the classic example, but what about other examples where you thought, here's a controversial policy we're going to aim off? You were coming in and saying, oh, we shouldn't do that because we'll have media flack on.
No, I think actually the diaries sort of bear me out of the view that I was never, I would always maybe, part of my job, part of my mind would be thinking how the media would take to something, but I would never see that as a reason to do or not to do something. I think, if anything, I was the one who would quite often be arguing with politicians that they were worrying about it too much, and that if they thought they could do it, then they should do it. But it was interesting to see, because what happens with the, here we're at the Institute for Government, with the civil service machine, I was always amazed at the extent to which they consumed a huge proportion of what they thought about the political operation of the government from what they saw in the media. So, for example, they would all those Alastair Campbell coming, we better think about what the headline's going to be. And I probably didn't give a damn. I probably wanted to actually sit down and think, well, here's a problem, how we're going to crack it. But I did my blog this morning about this whole benefit reform debate. Now, I think here is an area where we did absorb too much of the kind of media agenda as well as our own agenda. Now, don't get me wrong, Tony Blair always believed that there are too many people who become dependent on benefits, and those who genuinely need them, you've got to help them, but those who are scrounging off the state, you've got to deal with them. Always believe that. But I think the way the debate has developed, both through our time and particularly now with what was happening yesterday, is that it was fascinating. I watched the BBC News last night. They have the headlines, the BBC headlines of what's happening. You then have a shot of a bishop. You then have the Daily Mail and the Daily Express headlines about scroungers. So the broadcast is acting as a kind of echo chamber. That is an area where the debate has been skewed, in my view, by the weight of opinion on one side of an argument over years. Europe is another good example. We don't have a sensible debate on Europe in this country. We've never had it, have we?
There's actually a range of issues which it's not possible to have a sensible debate about in this country. Europe, I suppose, is the big one.
The value of MPs?
Prison policy, drugs policy, Richard Branson was giving some very interesting evidence today. But no politicians really dare put their, or very few politicians in office dare put their feet.
But I think they
in
can
those
much
waters.
more than they realise. And I think actually, if you think about the last general election, David Cameron had pretty much all of the papers. The Mirror was still backing away for Gordon. But if you were to take the papers as where public opinion in this country lies, it doesn't. Public opinion, I think, has become much more sophisticated, and actually politicians should be emboldened by that. But I fear that on both sides, that has not yet happened.
Don't you think that one of the developments of the last 15 years or so is that the tabloid virus, if we may call it that, has escaped from just the tabloids and now infects a large part of some of the broadcast media, including on occasion the BBC, and indeed some of the broadsheets. That's the new development.
Well, I said in the submission to Leveson that stories which, in our day, would have been an "and finally" on News at 10, on a quiet news day might lead the news. Stories which would have been a diary story about a celebrity or a politician saying something a bit daft would have been a diary story back then, but now could just as easily end up on a broadsheet front page as a tabloid front page. And I think that is that's just a result of these two huge forces of change which have come through. One is 24/7 news, and the other is the advent of the internet. It's forced newspapers to change, and that's forced television to change as well.
Can we explore that? Because we were talking beforehand. You blog, you Twitter, and all that. Chris doesn't yet.
Tweet is the verb.
I'm going to grow vegetables.
Tweet is the verb.
Twitter is the phenomenon. Tweet is the verb.
Yes.
As always, I'm glad to be spun by you, Alastair. Let's take that up. You didn't have that around when you left.
I wish we had.
Explain.
Because I think it actually gives the communicator and the public a much greater say in the landscape that we're shaping. Back when we started in 1994, and I don't make any apology for this, I think we had to do it to get the Labour Party into shape to win an election and to, if you like, tame the feral beast, which was just as feral then, but smaller than it became when Tony made what I thought was an excellent speech, and no, I didn't write it. But back then, if you had the BBC News on your agenda story, if you had the Times splashing on it, and say the Mail, Mirror, Sun all doing a page 2 or a page 9 lead on it, you could safely say you'd set the agenda for the day. There's no such thing as an agenda now. The agenda is being set second by second, microsecond by microsecond. There are very, very few days that you have an event like that on the wall. or President Obama announces that bin Laden's been killed, or you have a new Prime Minister, or the Queen opens the Olympics, or whatever it might be. They are very, very rare events that command the whole attention. Now, we can shape the agenda, and the public can shape the agenda, and the politicians, Chris and I were talking about this, and Chris I know is thinks I've gone a bit kind of doolally about this stuff, but I think we were saying that politicians, they go home to their constituencies at weekends, another weekend off, they're there during the summer, another long holiday, when in fact they're working their clogs off, most of them, the good ones. Twitter, social media, gives them an opportunity actually to be joining up networks and ideas. So I think if we'd had it back then, I would have embraced it as much as I've embraced it now that I'm not there.
Alistair's a much more modern man than I am. I'm going to grow vegetables in my next incarnation. I shan't be doing any tweeting, or what tweeting do you call it?
Tweeting.
Tweeting. But hold on, Chris.
I bet you do. I bet you do.
I
and
bet
also,
you I don't.
I'll bet you. I tweeted on arrival that I'd arrived, because I'm a bit like the Queen, you have to say where you've been these days. And said I was with Chris, and somebody said, try and get him on Twitter, he'd be brilliant. Why did they say that? Because of the observations in his diaries, because he notices interesting things, which you then share, and you can build an argument. You'd be a very good ambassador on Twitter for politics.
But it would be very interesting. The interesting question is the exchange with their constituents. Now, you represented a very working class seat in North East England.
Well, they don't do a lot of tweeting, I think.
More than you probably expect.
Yes, probably more.
Yeah, they will.
At the schools in your constituency,
God, if this is a qualification for being an MP now, I'm so glad I retired at the last election.
No, it's a part of it. The qualification of an MP should be the same as it's always been, that you believe things, you've got strong values, you know how to help people, and you want to use power to do that. But I think we're talking about the media and that corrosiveness and the corrosive effect that they've had. I see Twitter and the social networks as being possibly part of the solution. Now, they're also part of a problem. I'm making a documentary at the moment about alcoholism, and I've just discovered some extraordinary stuff about the links between the drinks companies and Facebook. Unbelievable. Now, so that's something that, so there's more. I'm not saying it's perfect, but I'm saying that if you're trying to promote, as you and I believe the same thing in this, that actually basically most people who go into politics are good people, they're trying to do their best, that message never gets through to the public, then I think social networks are a good place to promote that message.
Yeah, the other thing about them, though, is they encourage short attention spans, and I've...
Yeah, but so does 24 News, and so does the internet.
Well, yes, the whole world does. I mean, you can't have a...
But people are reading more books about
when we were
politics
first elected in '97, everybody had a pager, except me, actually. But and
you had problems with John Prescott over it.
It did get me into a certain amount of trouble once.
Well, John Prescott used to regularly ignore his page, I can tell you that.
But you'd be having a conversation with someone, and they're surreptitiously looking at their pager or the incoming messages on their mobile phone. I mean, it drives me bonkers.
Yeah, can we move on to another topic? You spent a lot of time from '94 onwards with newspaper proprietors and editors, including those who had been very, very hostile to Labour in the preceding thing.
Yeah.
Do you spend too much time on it?
Yeah.
Aren't they always going to, in the end, betray you?
Well, they're two different questions.
Yeah.
I don't think to be absolutely frank, I don't think we spent that much time with them. And what's more, I think we always had a pretty realistic view. What always gets thrown at us, 16, 17 years later, is you flew halfway around the world to bow down before Rupert Murdoch. We flew halfway around the world to Hayman Island because we'd been invited to a conference of all Murdoch's editors. And to me, I remember having an argument with Bruce Grocott about this, a man for whom Chris and I's diaries both share huge admiration and fondness. Bruce thought it was a terrible thing to do. I thought, strategically, politically at that time, it was a complete no-brainer. We had to do that. Sometimes in opposition, you need controversy to get noticed. If you go and read the speech that Tony made, it was a classic Tony Blair, third way, new Labour, this is my stall. He told them they were wrong on Europe. He told them they were wrong about things about, the effects of Thatcherite, hard right economic policies. That was what he did. Now, did we know that he'd get more notice because of the edge? Did we think it would help the sun come round? The answer to both of those things is yes. But actually, if you go and look, maybe this is one thing that will come out of Leveson. I think it'd be a very good thing if it did. A bit like Obama has to produce, he publishes his diary, you know who he meets, and you see that every day. Maybe our prime ministers should do the same. But I don't think way back then, did I see lots of editors? Of course I did. It was part of my job. Did I see people like you every single day? Yes, I did. But I don't think we spent that much, not nearly as much time as people think.
I actually agree.
But I still think it's too much.
I actually agree with Alastair about the trip to Hayman Island in, whenever it was, 1996, was it? Something like that.
I don't know.
Five or six. Because I think neutralising, which is the best you could hope for,
Yeah.
the Murdoch press, having just lost 4 general elections in a row, I didn't feel we could take even a little punt on the outcome of the 5th one, and so neutralising the Murdoch press had to be a key strategic objective. So
Yeah, but you said in your diaries, Chris, it's quite interesting, particularly in the volume which has just been published, going up to 97,
yes,
or going up to 99, you had hopes that the Blair government would take action against the press.
well, I moved actually January 1995, a little bill which would have broken up the big conglomerates, and I actually think that politically that wasn't possible at the time. I was as a backbench MP, you can say things that people in the top ranks can't say, but I do believe now it is possibly politically
you see,
possible,
the other thing
because they've got too big, and what successive governments, the Labour government and indeed the Cameron government, have tried to do is ride the tiger. Usually it ends badly, as it did with Cameron and Coulson, for example.
But you see, the thing that, I mean, I think what I was surprised about, maybe I shouldn't be surprised really, but I agreed with a lot of the big political points that Chris was making repeatedly through his diaries. And one of the reasons why it was always a nonsense to portray me as having had all this quotes, power, close quotes, in relation to policy, I was probably arguing for some of the same things as Chris was arguing about publicly. I would argue privately, but then I'd have to go and do briefings and say, well, I don't know what you're talking about because Tony Blair's not remotely interested in that, because that was my job. But I felt from pretty early on that, and look, let's go, people, because she's not terribly well and the Iron Lady's now out and all that, people aren't really meant to say these sorts of things about Mrs. Thatcher, but let's just understand this whole kind of what I deem as basically corrupt relationship between politics and media. It started with the whole knighthoods and peerages and all this sorts of stuff, and nobody batted an eyelid about that. And yet that, to me, was a really poisoned relationship, and I agreed with what Chris Patton said yesterday, that politicians actually, in many ways, both main parties, to some extent, have demeaned themselves, because the Sun didn't win us the election. They backed us because they knew we were going to win. Now, that was the dance that we were having. And when we went to the Hayman Island, I described this conversation with Paul Keating, who was Australian Prime Minister, knew Murdoch pretty well, and he gave us some very, very, clever strategic advice. He said, look, the thing about Rupert, you've got to remember about Rupert, his interests are Rupert 1, Rupert 2, Rupert 3, his business interests, and then the family maybe, and that's it. And the thing about Rupert is you can do deals with Rupert, but you never say a deal's been done. And that's the reality.
But isn't there interesting? I mean, your former deputy and distinguished BBC correspondent Lance Price wrote a very interesting book on prime ministers and the press, and made a revealing point there that those prime ministers who were most distant from the press were often the most successful. I mean, I'm not just talking about Attlee, who found out about his ticker-tape machine.
Yeah, and only won one election.
And then, well, he won two.
Two, a big pun, sorry.
He won two elections. One, not really.
It didn't last long, is what I meant.
Yeah. Well, he was Labour leader for 20 years, so...
no, but I mean, he should have had more, given his power, his strength, he should have been in power for longer.
And then you got, in a funny sort of way, you were right, Thatcher had a funny relationship with the press, but...
She was distant.
She was distant.
On one level,
yeah.
But she used them ruthlessly.
Yeah, but what I felt with Tony Blair was, funny enough, he was much more cynical about us lot in the press than the public image was.
Yeah.
He knew how unimportant some of us were, curiously. Gordon Brown had a different attitude. Gordon was just like John Major, who was read every headline and thought they mattered. In a curious sort of way, I know Tony Blair, and I think to some extent David Cameron aren't like that.
But I think the thing about both Tony and David Cameron, with whom I have discussed this subject on one occasion, I think both would be of the view that they'd be much, much, much happier doing their jobs, the job Cameron now does, the job Tony did, in a country, in a culture that didn't have this all-pervasive media noise around them, but that there is a slight little nagging doubt at the back of their minds that if they just basically say, you lot can F off out of it, that is not going to destroy them, but if the whole of the British media did decide to go after a Prime Minister, say like, they went after Chris as a loony MP backing a bomb gang, it does make governing a lot harder, I think.
Why do we take them, when the Prime Minister goes to Washington, say, why do we fill the plane up with the lobby when there's perfectly good Washington correspondence for most of the networks,
you see,
who should report?
that's the whole thing about the lobby, you see. When I first went in, first of all, I was a lobby journalist, and I didn't think much of the lobby system then, as you know. Then when we were in opposition, I used to watch the government communications and see how inept it was at dealing with what we were up to and what the media were up to and what have you. So I knew we had to make changes. And of course the press was saying to us, look, you've got to sort out that bloody government machine when you get in there. The minute you go in there and you do the sort of things that actually clearly needed to be done, the biggest objectors to me putting the briefings on the record when we did that were the press, were the lobby, because that was their access that nobody else got. And in fact, I bumped into Cameron at Gus O'Donnell's farewell, and he was asking the very same question Chris just asked. He said, why do we take the press on the plane when you can get... And I suspect the honest answer is because they pay for the flights.
Yeah, I can...
So I think it's a sort of public-private partnership situation.
Yeah, absolutely. They pay for the flights.
They charge them Club Plus, I think.
Well, they charge the newspaper
and
Club
put them
Plus.
in steerage.
No, they're pretty well looked after.
Oh, he's very nicely looked after. I can tell you, someone who did it for some years, it also, for the journalists on it, it was, you did get more access than you get a lot of times. I did trips with Margaret Thatcher, I did with John Major, I did with Tony Blair.
But the number of flights where, I mean, Tony, as you know, is a great communicator, but they're there, they know they're paying, they know actually that, say they're going to Washington, the Washington correspondents are going to try and get the story, so they feel they've got to produce, and they think the story is going to come from the plane. And it usually comes, the best example is a story that Robert Peston did about tax. It was a load of old nonsense, but because it was the FT, it sort of flew, and it sort of set the agenda for the first 2 days of the trip. So I got to a point where I said, look, we're going to cut back on this sort of access on the plane, because it was just it was a disaster waiting to happen. And then I remember not going on a trip, and poor old Godric let Tony go at the back of the plane. I can't remember what it was about now, and there was all hell broke loose. And there was a wonderful time when John Sargent, who was chairman of the lobby, I can't remember if you were on this trip, and I'd offered to take Tony to the back of the plane, and John Sargent says, don't worry, we're watching a film. Because John was watching a film, and of course when the rest of them got to hear about this, they went absolutely berserk.
No, I wasn't on that trip. My colleague Phil Webster was, and nearly strangled John Sargent. It wasn't the only time in his life he nearly wanted to strangle John Sargent. But there were advantages of insight and access on that. But it was also one of the great aspects of journalism is voyeurism. And you see people mixing, and you get a bit of insight. Seeing, I remember seeing Tony Blair with Bill Clinton and so on. You get a bit of feeling. I was there. I remember vividly when Monica Lewinsky thing broke, and sitting in the White House then, and the most nervous man in the press conference was Tony Blair, because he was. So there was Bill Clinton, bending the truth.
And actually, it was Phil Murphy, PA, London. Later worked for the Labour Party, but actually, if you remember, it was his question, because Clinton, I mean, we talked to Clinton beforehand, and Clinton always had a bat it out of the park answer prepared for a press conference. He just had to wait for the right question to come, and that was the question. I can't remember what the question was, but it was the one that he'd decided was going to be the clip on all the bulletins that night. And you're right, Clinton was, himself, and Tony was, this could go anywhere.
Yeah, and he was. Before we open it up to questions, because there are a lot of very distinguished people, lots of experience.
There aren't any privy councillors apart from you, Peter.
More distinguished than that. Is Leveson. Will Leveson change anything? I mean, when you talk about I'm struck, now as an outsider, is how some of the myth, particularly of Wapping, particularly the Sun and the Murdoch titles, and I, of course, used to work for the Times, has been exploded by Leveson. That it's actually, I mean, if you read the Sun now, it's very strident, because the power it thought it had, both over Labour Prime Ministers and Tory ones, is now exploded. And therefore, it's possible to have a more honest dialogue. And a lot of the frustrations at the tabloid end are because they know that the bluff's been called.
Hopefully, but don't you think that, I mean, I think it's not, I think there is a link between the fact that Ed Miliband is getting such a bad press in most of the press and the fact that he took the stance he did on phone hacking. So I think actually the press are still able to negativise the agenda about an individual or an issue, which then gets followed by the broadcasters. So that the story becomes the polls, the story becomes what the papers are saying, as opposed to, actually, you made a very interesting speech last week, which, unless you read it on the Labour Party website, you probably didn't know what he said. So I think I'm not as sanguine as that. I do think Leveson, I mean, I've been to Leveson once, and apparently I've got to go back when the politics stuff comes up, but the thing I find most interesting have been his questions when he's been interrupting witnesses. And my sense is he keeps coming back to the same thing. System of regulation, PCC, bust. Can you have regulation that is obviously has to be set up by Parliament and therefore proposed presumably by government, but can be independent of politics and independent of media, and what do you do about the internet? So he's bang on the right questions, and I suspect we'll come up with some good solutions which the government then will water down and probably not do.
Chris?
Well, I think there's a historic opportunity here, which never happened in my lifetime before, where I think we could say to News Corps, choose between Sky and the newspapers. And I would not be against, though you may find this surprising, giving News Corps a greater share of Sky, because subject to one or two conditions which I'll just mention. One is that the exemption that Mrs. Thatcher inserted on Murdoch's behalf that exempts Sky from having to produce the same, any given quantity of British-produced content. Sky are exempt from that, whereas the terrestrial channels are not. And I would oblige them to continue providing a respectable news service as they do at the moment. But I would not be against giving him a much bigger stake, and I think the shareholders would buy that in return for giving up the newspapers.
What I meant also was the broader culture. I just wonder whether that's changing. I take it to a few. Just one point. If you were starting your job again in Downing Street now, Alastair, how would you...
Now?
Yeah, if you're starting it now, assuming you were working for a Labour Prime Minister, not David Cameron, slightly dicey sort from you. Assuming you were doing that...
I just gave it to him.
How would you approach the media in a different way so that a government could do the necessary difficult and risky decisions they have to take?
What, based on the knowledge I've acquired?
Based on the knowledge you've got now. I mean, because there was a sense in which certainly the first term of the Blair government was a fairly risk-averse one. I mean, the objective was...
I think it was risk-averse. No, I don't buy that. I think, to be honest, I think Tony was too defensive about this in his book. There's nothing risk-averse about deciding to try and do Northern Ireland. There was, quite a lot of the big legislative change that I'm most proud of Labour having done came in that first term. But I think in terms of our media, I've got no doubt at all, we did take too much of the mindset and also some of the tactics of opposition campaigning into government communications. And I would definitely say you just don't need to worry about it that much. You have to worry about politics and campaigning all the time, but it's not front of mind. And you've got to... So I think too many of our ministers, I think, again, this comes through Chris's assessment of some of them in the diaries, that too many of our ministers were thinking less about getting on, governing, doing the big things. It's always got to be according to a strategic framework. And the thing about politics and government, the strategic framework for government, there's no reason why it shouldn't match up with what you're trying to do for the next election as well. So they're not inconsistent. But I think at a basically, I would say, we don't need to worry that much about the day-to-day. We have to focus on the strategic all the time.
Chris?
Well, I mean, if we were starting again, I'd say keep them at arm's length to a much greater extent. Certainly don't take them on the plane to Washington or wherever. Leave it to the Washington correspondents. I mean, I remember when Gordon Brown went to Washington. The lobby decided what the story was going to be in advance, and it was going to be, actually it was New York he was
snubbed.
going to.
He was going to be snubbed.
Yes, Obama snubs Brown was going to be the story, and that floated actually, even the respectable papers like the one you used to work for led with that. That went on for 24 hours until they all moved to the G8 summit in Philadelphia or somewhere, where he had plenty of FaceTime, so that one died. Then, when Gordon went the second time, they decided in advance the trick would be to try and persuade Gordon to apologise for the recession, as though he'd created the financial crisis. And they took that, Nick Robinson, the BBC, took that into the Oval Office of the White House. They were asking.
I think
to the
you're
astonishment of the Americans.
You're two conspiracy theorists there, Chris. Conspiracy theories sounds all right. Dealing with the egos of my former colleagues, the idea that they've ever been in conspiracy. Anyway, let me open it up now to questions. And we've got some mics. The other thing we also got is questions from Twitter.
Yeah, do you want me to deal with these?
Yeah, you can ask yourself a question.
Hey.
Alistair, the one guarantee of you having a favourable question is you ask it yourself. We've got one.
Except I've left my BlackBerry in there.
Yeah, for Christopher attention, one from the IFG doing that. I'll look out for their things. Now, please, questions. A number of people who worked with you are in this room who I'm sure want to ask questions, but far away. Yeah, Ivor. And could you explain who you are as well? Oh, you've got a mic. Yeah.
Hi, Ivor Gaber from City University London. Alastair, you mentioned rightly, and I find myself in agreement with almost everything that's been said, with one exception. Well, maybe more than one exception. One of the good things that came out of Leveson after the parliamentary debate was we had the revelations, the transparency about how many times Cameron and his colleagues met Senior News International. And we were all shocked. So I thought this is amazing, 32 times in 12 months or whatever. So I thought I'd just go back. Now, the good news for you is I downloaded the Kindle editions of all three of your diaries. So there's a bit of money. But the bad news is it makes them very searchable.
Okay.
So let me just quote you. This is not a long question, Peter. You say, I don't think we saw as much of Murdoch or whatever as people said. So I looked at 6 categories. I looked at how often over the 3 volumes of the diaries.
So we're talking how many years?
1994.
7 years.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you met with the BBC Director General, who happens to be Editor-in-Chief of Britain's biggest media organisation. You mentioned him. So it's only mentions, but I had checked their relevant mentions. They're not, that Murdoch gets on my whatever. They are specific. BBC Director Generals, there were 2, 7. Proprietor of the Daily Mail, 16. Editor of the Daily Mail. Sorry?
Rothermere?
Yep, 16 references to you.
Oh, references. I think I met Rothermere twice in my entire life.
All right. No, well, I've gone through that. They're references.
They may be recording my abusive letters to them.
No, but let me get to the crunch. Editor of the Daily Mirror, 30. Editor of the Sun, 35. Rupert Murdoch, 202. Mentions, but they're specific mentions,
Yeah, okay, but that's because Rupert Murdoch is a very, very powerful media figure. That doesn't mean we've met Rupert Murdoch 202 times.
No, I'm not saying that. But he's slightly obsessive figure in your 3 diaries, even though your recollection now isn't. That's a big figure.
No, because my recollection actually fits with that. Was Murdoch look, a lot of that will be me talking about Murdoch in briefings. Not least, remember the whole Berlusconi nonsense and all that. There was that, but Murdoch was a big story a lot of the time. And so I don't think that actually backs up, does dispute
I've got a bit of hard evidence here.
Okay, Chris, come on.
I noted it down. This is from the memoirs of Piers Morgan.
Well, wait a minute. Chris, let me say it. Piers Morgan, who, no, I'm going to prebut.
No, hold on.
Okay, all right.
Chris and Charles, but I'll bring you in.
All right, I have a very good response to this.
Okay. Right. Bored one evening, I counted up the number of times I'd met Tony Blair, and the result was astonishing, really, or slightly shocking, according to your viewpoint.
Yeah.
I had 22 lunches, 6 dinners, 6 interviews, 24 further one-to-one chats over tea and biscuits, and numerous telephone calls.
Right.
What on earth were we doing, wasting all that time
Well,
on a
we
toe rag
weren't.
like Piers Morgan?
We weren't. I'll tell you why. If you read Piers Morgan's diaries, you may ask yourself how it came to be that one of those face-to-face meetings with Tony Blair in Downing Street took place in 1996. So I don't think he's the most reliable witness. And if you ask Piers himself has admitted this. Look, we did see the Mirror pretty regularly. I don't know if it still goes on. There's an annual event at the Labour Party conference. Mirror, Victor Blank, if he was then the boss, and Piers would come in. Tony would probably see, how many times did he see you? Over a parliament, probably 3 or 4 times a year. Yeah. He'd say, get Peter Riddell in. I haven't seen Peter Riddell for a while. Murdoch is, I guess, I accept is in a category of his own because he's a big player on the media/political scene. But I don't believe, I can't say I'll go and do this myself, but the next time you go to your Kindle, analyse how many of those were observations about us dealing with stories to do with Murdoch, dealing with policy issues to do with Murdoch, which Chris probably thinks we didn't do the right thing, and also dealing with some of the face-to-face stuff that we had with him. But I would be, again, I don't know this, but when I saw the Tory government / coalition / Murdoch contacts, they were far greater than they were with us, I suspect. And the one that really, really, really surprised me was Michael Gove. Because that was about Murdoch trying to get into the British education system, and I thought that was genuinely worrying and should have had more attention. But I don't buy this sort of Murdoch mythology based on that analysis at all.
So again, that's something I think will have changed.
Alan Evans.
Thank you. Alan Evans, Cabinet Office and Institute for Government. It's a question that follows on from what Peter was saying, almost about what you'd have done differently if you could have your time again. And picking up one of the things that you personally were criticised for, Alastair, that somehow you politicised the Government Communication Information Service. I should say that is complete and utter nonsense, but it is one of these myths that survives. But looking back on it, did you and your small group of New Labour people, when you came in, do too little to communicate to the civil service about the type of changes you want to see, or was the civil service which you inherited too weak and set in its ways and unable to change to respond to your demands?
Well, you see, it's interesting that Alan, who, for those who don't know, was the first civil service head of the Strategic Communications Unit, which we set up in 1999, 8, when I spent a summer holiday trying to work out why we were no longer able, it seemed to me, to communicate as effectively on the strategic level as we've been in opposition now that we were in government, and that was one of the things that we brought in. And I think the politicisation thing, I said earlier about how Peter and I and anything to do with the communications, we turned into these sort of bogey figures. So the politicisation became a very, very easy line to run. I think we communicated a lot with the civil service, and I think actually the civil service came back with a lot as well. If I'm being absolutely frank, I think that in a funny sort of way, the non-communications parts of the civil service were better at engaging with the changes that we were trying to make than parts of the communications bits were. I was routinely accused of getting fired virtually every head of every government communications department. I wasn't involved in any of them. Some departed because they didn't like the change of government, some departed because they didn't get on with ministers, some departed because they moved on to other things. It's true there was a lot of turnover, but I think that you probably find that happens with any major change of government like that. But I think we tried to communicate internally. We didn't always get it right. I also felt, by the way, I always had a lot of support, particularly in the early days from Robin Butler. I always found him really supportive in terms of saying, look, you're in, this is now your job, the government's changed, you're perfectly entitled to bring about change in this area. Got on perfectly well with Mike Granite running the civil service end of it. But I think culturally, the civil service, just like every other part of our national life, was coming to terms with this very changed media landscape and just didn't always get it in a way that I felt we got it. And it's like, you know, sometimes you can see things really clearly. You can see how change is impacting upon an organisation. But the hardest thing is to persuade that organisation that it's almost like, you know, I'm not doing this for us. I'm kind of trying to help you here. But it was I'd say, you know, I mean, I'm very proud of the fact, for example, that very few of the people who work with or for me directly have ever gone out and slagged me off for the way that I try to run things. I've had lots of people who know bugger all about it, you know, criticising me the whole time for it, and lots of people for political reasons doing it. But I don't think I feel we made the minimum of changes that you need to make in the media age to communicate effectively for a government that is trying to do the right things for the country.
Right. Andrew Cullen.
Thanks. Andrew Kahn, now of Nomura and the Institute for Government, but previously for UK Trade and Investment. A comment and a question. The comment is about Prime Minister's trips abroad on aeroplanes. I did quite a lot of them, leading business delegations. What struck me was the difference between the way the Prime Minister has dealt with the businessmen and the press. When going around with the businessmen, also vice-chancellors, directors of museums and so on, each one of them wanted a private word with the Prime Minister. And that was what I had to organise. It was jolly difficult, but that's what they wanted. The press went in a pack. The Prime Minister would go to the back of the plane and all the press would be there together, and none of them wanted there to be private words. And I just a comment that why did the press always have to operate in packs? It's very strange. There's a sort of pack mentality, and I wonder that that's one of the problems we face. The question is this. We in Britain are very bad, I think, at looking at what other countries do. When you've seen the way how the relationship between ministers and the media in other countries, which countries would you want us to imitate or at least learn from? Which would you think Leveson could usefully go and have a look at and bring in some of what they do to improve matters?
Well, I think the plane thing and the pack, you see, they both operate and don't operate like a pack. Right, you're on a plane, the Prime Minister's at the front of the plane, the press are all on there, they want to get access to the Prime Minister because they hope he'll say something remotely interesting or newsworthy and it will justify their trip and keep them on the telly, keep them in the papers. That's perfectly legitimate. We only have a limited amount of time to give to them, so it actually suits both interests in a way. Half an hour of the flight, Prime Minister goes and sees the press. Actually, they don't, but in addition to that, they don't operate as a pack because they're all, I remember I'll never forget this once, we were on a trip to Washington and John Craig, he was then on the Express, he's now at Sky. I went up to the back of the plane, I came back, he was in my seat talking to Fiona and Cherie, and there was Tony's red box literally sitting there, you know, full of bloody stuff. Now, I kicked him off pretty quickly, but actually, that's a classic example of somebody not operating like a pack, thinking, right, I'll pick this up from John Sargent, Phil Webster or whoever, I'll have a wander. So they operate like a pack and they don't. So you've always got to watch them. In terms of watching other countries, I mean, I don't think I'd really like when you go to the White House, and it always used to be, it was a bit embarrassing, but the president would walk in, the Americans would stand, the Brits would stay seating. I'm not sure I want the press to have to stand up and curtsy. I don't ever want to see a journalist at a press conference feeling they can't ask really difficult, straight, brutal questions. And I think, you see, if you go to, I think Germany has a very intelligent political press, but I think, you know, a lot of it's quite hard work. I think France has a press, a sort of political media nexus that is way too close. Italy is just a complete, I mean, you know, don't even go there.
Well, you want to go there, but not go there.
Yeah. I quite like the Australian press, actually, even though you see Murdoch there. But Australian press is very rough and very tough. A lot of very strong local papers. Television, no, maybe not, actually. Australia's too much like us. Canada, a bit dull. I don't know. I don't know. I'd say somewhere between I quoted this guy, John Hartigan, who's one of Murdoch's Aussie executives. I quoted him in my Leveson evidence. I said, he once said to me, the thing about the British press, it's the best in the world, and it's the worst in the world, and it's sometimes in the same edition. And I think that is actually, there's something in that. So what I'd hope Leveson doesn't do is get rid of the best, but for God's sake, we've got to do something about the worst.
Chris?
Yes, I'm not qualified to compare many other countries with ours, though I do suspect we've got one of the worst in some respects. I agree with Alastair and some of the best. But what I would like to see is more diversity. We don't have a free press. We have one that's owned by a handful of oligarchs, some of whom abuse their position and some of whom don't. I mean, the Harmsworths currently, although they spent 100 years abusing their position, but currently they leave that to Mr. Paul Dacre. They delegate. But it's not a satisfactory situation. So what I want to see is diversity. I want to see them broken up so that there's more schools of thought competing.
Could I give an answer to the question? It's Adam Smith gave the answer. When people in the same trade get together, they combine. And I've written about this in a book I wrote on politicians. One of the most depressing things being a journalist was this pack mentality. And there's a pressure against someone doing their own thing. I mean, not necessarily in the entrepreneurial way of John Craig, but the particularly on a foreign trip, the worst crime is not to have got the story someone else has got. And there is a real pack mentality, and that's reinforced by people working together at Westminster.
One of my first sort of big bust-ups with lots of other journalists. Came when I was a journalist on a trip that Neil Kinnock made to Washington, and I ended up writing a piece for the New Statesman about how they operated. And I remember the headline the New Statesman chose were "You are the pits," which wasn't a great way of endearing myself with all of my colleagues. But actually that was a classic where the combined shared interest of Thatcher and Reagan and the British press to do in Neil Kinnock came in. You know, I don't lightly talk about conspiracy, but effectively it was a conspiracy.
It was a conspiracy.
Yeah, but of course, because I was in a sense part of it, because I was at the briefings where all these things were said and these facts were twisted and these impressions were, I ended up writing the whole thing. And I mean, some people probably never spoke to me again.
But actually what happened, that was the pre-87 election.
Yeah.
I happened to be, it was a fascinating event. There was side by side, Neil Kinnock going to Washington to see Reagan for a minimal amount of time, and Thatcher going to Moscow with Gorbachev.
Yes.
Yeah.
And most of us went
Crowds
on
lining the streets.
and it was the most extraordinary event. And the Charles Powell, the elder brother of Jonathan, who was the chief of staff to Tony Blair, was involved with the Reagan White House in trying to stitch up Neil Kinnock. I mean, that is a fact. That's what happened. There was a stitch-up. The journalists weren't actually part of the formal part of the stitch-up. There was a formal.
No, but they sort of knew, and that's my point is that's the story they wanted. It's like Gordon wanted. They wanted Obama to snub Gordon. They wanted Reagan to stitch up Neil, and so trying to blow that open was, it wasn't a terribly popular thing to do.
Yeah, but it's very. That was an enormously striking contrast. I only learned later about actually there was a bit of a stitch-up. The irony being, of course, that Thatcher and Gorbachev was in the reverse way.
Yeah.
As a
Now, I think we've also lost. You see, I think we've lost some. Tony Bevins at the Independent. He was one of those because he was somebody who didn't run with the pack, and I think we don't have enough people like him within the kind of political media.
And it's more difficult also in the 24-hour news.
No,
now we're approaching the end.
Before we do the sketch writers, am I right in thinking do put their heads together after Prime Minister's questions each day and agree a line to take,
well, it doesn't show in their copy. It doesn't show in their copy.
I thought
they sometimes have a civilised cup of tea.
They have a cup of tea.
They have a cup of tea together, but they're very different personalities, I assure you. Now, I'm going to group some now. The gentleman there who's been extremely patient, and Tony King, and the gentleman over there. And could you be brief, because we're in the last 5 minutes.
It suddenly occurred to me that politics is no place for somebody who's sensitive to criticism. Some commentators believe that people can be persuaded to vote against their own interests. And the condition for that is you need to have most of the media behind you. So we see in Putin's Russia, Berlusconi, press almost 100% behind them, and it works. And I just wonder if Cameron had won the election in 2005, the banking crisis would have happened in pretty much the same way. But it would have been reported entirely differently by the tabloids.
Yeah, and what's your question? Sorry, what's your question?
Well, there would have been, what do you think these negative things about politicians, that Gordon Brown was a traitor and all the rest of it, and we read that in some of the papers, and you remember the spelling mistakes in the Sun.
Sorry,
how much?
We're
Yes.
pressurised for time. Could you do it in half a sentence, please?
Do you think that these things really do change elections?
Well,
okay, no,
sorry,
yeah. I
okay.
get the point there, Tony. Tony King, this way, thanks. I take the point on that.
I think this really is a question. Right at the beginning of the discussion, Alastair gave the impression that the influence of the media on the content of government policy was frequently exaggerated. Chris riposted to that by listing a number of areas, quite important ones, where he thought the press had influenced government policy. My question is, which of the two am I to believe?
Could be both.
Yeah, right. And gentleman over there.
The media attacks on Gordon really were unprecedented in the personal nature. considering how close the election ended up being, surprisingly, did the media win that election for David Cameron?
Right. And the gentleman there, just behind you, Lauren, there, here.
I just wonder, with newspaper circulations being in possibly terminal decline, the power of newspapers is waning, which is possibly a good thing with the rise of the internet and social media, as Alastair alluded to. Perhaps we could get more comment on that.
Yeah, right. We've got four very interesting questions. The question there, a very interesting one from the gentleman about the influence of the disparagement of people, what effect that had, the reporting, how the banking crisis would have been reported differently as a different Prime Minister. Tony King's question on the very interesting, the core point about the influence of the media on actual government decisions, and also the issues which can and cannot be discussed. Then we had the gentleman there saying unprecedented. From my experience, there's very little unprecedented in media criticism. And then coming back to the term of decline of newspapers. Chris?
Yeah. I think that newspaper coverage changes election outcomes? Sometimes. I think arguably 1992 and perhaps one or two others. I do believe it has an impact. I mean, goodness me, if you're an election candidate, you might, during the course of an election campaign, get 3 or 4 pieces of literature, if you're lucky, through the doors of your constituents. But with the Sun and the Mail and all the rest of them coming through the doors of your constituents every day, it's no contest. Tony King, does it influence government policy? I believe it does on some of the areas I listed. One could draw up other examples too. The media attacks on Gordon, were they unprecedented? Well, Gordon has himself to blame here to some extent, because Gordon did spend rather a lot of time manipulating the press for his own ends, and of course it all blew up rather badly. So I think it would be a bit precious to say that it was all someone else's fault, but certainly the attacks on him come the election were pretty serious, but some of it was self-inflicted, and I don't think we can escape that. Is the power of the media waning? Possibly. I think the jury's out. A lot depends on whether anything concrete comes out of Levinson, undoubtedly with all this tweeting and what is twittering?
Stuff.
Yeah, stuff. Must be having.
Stuff happens, as we know.
Yeah.
Must be having some sort of impact. I don't know.
I mean, the questions all kind of come together in a way, but the thing I always say about Cameron, he had a massive support in the papers. Gordon was getting hammered. Gordon, by his own admission, not the greatest communicator, and particularly in the sort of modern era, and yet Cameron didn't win a majority. And Gordon's biggest disaster, so-called, was the Rochdale incident, and we won Rochdale pretty comfortably. I think the public know that politicians and politics maybe spins them a line from time to time, but they sure as hell now know that the media do it as well, and they kind of, I think, make a much more sophisticated judgment, largely based on their own lives. Where Chris is right is that the media can still, I think, set the framework for a debate. And this is where you see, I don't think, what Tony King's question, I don't think Chris and I are disagreeing about much here, because I mentioned the benefits thing in Europe. These are areas where the press has made a sensible, reasonable debate very, very difficult to have. That has probably made government, certainly the government I was involved in, more cautious about doing some things that it should have done, and more keen to do things maybe that sometimes it shouldn't. But the bigger point I was trying to make is that the politicians should actually feel that they can do far more based upon their own judgment. Ultimately, they do know more about their subject than most specialists. They should do, because they're immersed in it the whole time. They should have a more strategic vision. They should have stronger values and deeper beliefs. That's why they go into politics. So I think politicians ought to be far more bold about their own convictions and far more adventurous in the way that they pursue those. And you take Tony, particularly latterly, a lot of the criticism made of him actually was that he frankly didn't care what anybody else said. He would just, particularly in relation to Iraq, he was going to do it. And I think that the point about whether all these attacks are unprecedented, and where I take a lot of hope about what's going on is I think the landscape is changing really, really quickly. I agree with Chris, it's a once-in-a-generation opportunity. If Leveson leads nowhere, that will be a total failure of government, and it will be a total failure of the media industry as well. It has to lead somewhere better than where we've been led to. And I think if that doesn't happen, then we might as well all go home, politics and media. And I also think that in relation to the changes of the internet, some of it I don't like, some of it is horrible. You can get loads of racism, loads of homophobia, loads of really, really bad, nasty stuff out there. But I think the centre of gravity in what I call the internet political debate, I think is in a healthier place than the centre of gravity in the mainstream media debate right now.
Very interesting point to end on. If I may take up the very interesting question about influence of gaffes and so on, I think we can easily exaggerate, because something's happened, and regard it as significant. Plenty of things are talking points, they're not necessarily turning points. Classic example happened in, I think it was the 2001 election, the John Prescott punch up in North Wales, which was one hell of a talking point. I remember in the Times room we watched
the only
it.
unscripted event of the campaign.
Yeah,
That is not true. That is not true.
And everyone talked about it. It didn't make slightest difference. And a lot of, the Rochdale example is a very, very interesting one. I think Rochdale rather, leaving aside its impact in the constituency, it reinforced people's views of Gore. It didn't change them. You have reinforcing events. I think that's where it's significant. I think it's a very interesting point about whether it changes it. On the whole, people build up their perceptions over a very, very long time.
But the other thing to remember about Prescott, which people forget, you talk about the only unscripted event, that was the same day as Sharon Storer outside the hospital banjaxing Tony Blair and Jack Straw being slow hand-clapped at the Police Federation. That was the day we launched the manifesto. And we went on to get a second consecutive three-figure majority. So I think insofar as it had an impact, it kept the media talking for 2 days and the public got on with thinking about how they were going to vote.
Yeah, I think my own conclusion, one can exaggerate much of the media influence on things. It's rather that the politicians and the media themselves believe the influence is greater. Now, Alastair's concluding remark, and before I ask you to thank Alastair and Chris, leads on perfectly to the last event in our Media in Government series on the 7th of March, which is the future regulation. Invitations will go out to that soon. I'd like to thank again Fisherman Hedges for their partnership in this very, very interesting series we've had. Alastair and Chris's books are available downstairs for...
Sadly, my e-book isn't.
The e-book you can get on you can go on the computer and
but
download it.
it's so complicated.
It's £2 or something.
£1.71 on Amazon.
£1.71 on Amazon.
If you want to see the book I'm reading, this is the best book going at the moment. How's that?
That reflects
the Elvis Encyclopedia. That is a book.
No, we don't want you.
4% say he is, and they may well be right.
Yeah.
And he signed Alastair's copy.
Yeah, I did.
Exactly, 2012.
Yeah, exactly. The real thing is, Alastair believes he's a reincarnation of Elvis. Anyway, the books are downstairs. We've also got drinks downstairs, and on the dining room below. I'd like, on your behalf, to thank both Chris and Alastair for what has been both an illuminating and extremely entertaining hour and 20 minutes. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, but I'm an old sparring partner of the two of them, and I've got my own views on that. So I'd like you to join me in thanking them both. Thank you.